In January this year, assuming this year for you is still 2024, I discussed the career of 1982 Formula One world champion Nico Rosberg and presented his career highlights in 15 quick segments. One of those segments was about the 1985 Detroit Grand Prix, where Nico won by nearly a minute as his wife prepared to give birth to a son. Just 4 days later, the world was introduced to Nico Rosberg, and in 2016 he too would become a world champion. This video is about arguably the more famous of the Rosbergs, and once again I've prepared 15 segments to highlight the career of a champion. As with all second-generation drivers, Nico had an admittedly privileged upbringing, with his father funding his early racing exploits and guiding him through karting. After achieving success while karting in France, Nico moved up to cars, winning the 2002 Formula BMW ADAC Championship for his dad's team. He then completed 2 seasons of Formula 3 before finding himself in the highly acclaimed ART Grand Prix team for the inaugural season of GP2, now known as Formula 2. Being a newcomer to the series, surrounded by extremely competitive racers such as Heikki Kovalainen, Scott Speed, Giorgio Pantano, Nelson Piquet Jr. and Jimmy Bruni, among others, Nico was never expected to win, but when he did at Magny-Cours in the sprint race, and then again at Silverstone and Hockenheim in the feature races. Coming into the final round at Bahrain, Nico simply needed to score within 3 points of Kovalainen to win the championship, so surely this meant he could take it relatively easy, right? Well, apparently not, because instead he decided to absolutely fly, taking pole by nearly 7/10 of a second and then winning both races in GP2's first ever double victory. If you don't understand how difficult this is to achieve, just keep in mind that in GP2, the winner of race 1 had to start race 2 from 8th place on the grid and then fight their way through the 7 cars who had finished immediately behind them, without the aid of DRS, which hadn't been introduced yet. At just 20 years old, Nico had proved that he was set for Formula 1. Half a year later, and once again in Bahrain, Nico made his F1 debut for Williams, the team for whom Keke had won the World Championship in 1982. While Williams weren't the dominant force they had once been, Nico was clearly up for the challenge, taking on significantly more experienced drivers in his fight for points. He ended up finishing 7th in his very first Grand Prix, just 1 place behind his teammate Mark Webber, who himself is worthy of an episode in this series. Nico famously also set the fastest lap of the whole race, less than a second from the lap record. Unfortunately, the rest of his rookie season would be less successful, as Williams struggled to develop the car, and he only scored points on one other occasion. 2007 was a much more competitive year for Williams and their brand new Toyota engines, because even though they were still struggling to challenge the might of McLaren and Ferrari, they were able to score points consistently. At the season finale in Brazil, the eyes of the world were understandably focused on the once-in-a-lifetime championship decider between Kimi Raikkonen, Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso, but had they looked a little bit further down the road, they would have spotted a nifty little Williams making up place after place, and even passing the BMWs of Heidfeld and Kubica. At the end of the race, Kimi Raikkonen was crowned world champion, but Nico Rosberg also shone with a 4th place finish, securing 9th place in the championship standings. The first race of the 2008 season was, in a word, chaos, as crashes and failures galore led to only 6 cars crossing the finish line. It may sound like getting a podium on a day like that would be easy, considering everyone else was jumping off the road, but in all honesty they were mainly doing that from behind Nico, who had seemed comfortable since the start of the race. Throughout the Grand Prix, Nico did battle with BMW's Nick Heidfeld, and even though Nick would eventually come out ahead, this race would still go down in history as the first time that Nico Rosberg would stand on an F1 podium. Standing next to him on the top step was Lewis Hamilton, Nico's best friend and teammate from his karting days, who would soon play a large part in the story of his career. Skipping ahead a few years to 2011, Nico was now established in F1 and had landed to drive at Mercedes, with his teammate being the legendary Michael Schumacher. Schumi had made his hotly anticipated return to F1 the previous season, but had struggled to find his form and had finished 2 places behind Rosberg in the standings. I could easily have included a number of races from that season on this list, but instead I've decided to include the whole of the 2011 season, for the simple reason that Michael had had a whole year in order to get back up to speed, and yet Nico still managed to beat him and lead the team, scoring points in 14 of the 19 races. I know that there will be people out there who think this isn't much of an achievement since Schumacher was far from his best here, but in all honesty, beating a 7-time world champion at even a fraction of his former strength is something to be commended. It was actually a pretty epic fight between the two of them, which came down to the wire at the last race in Brazil to effectively be best of the rest behind the Red Bulls, McLarens and Ferraris. He eventually finished 7th in the championship for the 3rd year in a row. The 2012 season got off to a worrying start for Nico, as he failed to score points in either of the first 2 races. Having now driven in over 110 Grand Prix, there was a chance that he'd only ever drive midfield cars. However, everything just seemed to click into gear at round 3 in Shanghai, when he put his car on pole position for the very first time in F1, over half a second faster than anyone else. You're actually seeing that lap now, providing the FOM haven't forced me to remove it. From then on, he was absolutely dominant, driving so comfortably that he only needed to pit twice while most others pitted 3 times, and he ran a set of medium tyres for over a third of the race. Eventually, he won by 21 seconds ahead of the McLarens of Button and Hamilton. It was Nico's first podium in nearly 2 years, let alone his first win, and the first win for Mercedes since their return to Formula 1. We now know that it was the first of many, many successes. Aside from Bahrain, which I mentioned a couple of times earlier, Nico had another happy hunting ground, and that was Monaco, where he actually lives. Having finished 2nd there in 2012, Mercedes came into the 2013 race with an even better car, and one that would be capable of winning the Grand Prix. However, he had a problem. For 2013, there would be a brand new legendary name above his teammate's garage, and that was his old karting rival Lewis Hamilton. In order to win Monaco, Nico would have to set the lap of his life in qualifying to beat not only Lewis, but also the charging Red Bulls of Vettel and Webber, who were the reigning world champion and the reigning Monaco winner respectively. Chances are that if you've made it this far into the video, you know exactly who took pole position, because otherwise I wouldn't have included it on this list. Nico Rosberg started first, crucially maintained the lead at the start, and then survived the rest of the race, which included a red flag stoppage and several safety cars. He ultimately led every single lap. Mercedes had another shot at victory in the British Grand Prix at Silverstone, but most were expecting it to go to Lewis Hamilton at his home race. That was until just the 8th lap when Lewis's tyre gave way, taking him down the order. There were then a raft of other punctures and delaminations which littered the track with debris and caused several safety cars, and through most of it the dominant Red Bull of Sebastian Vettel led the race, with Rosberg desperately hanging on to his coattails. That was until 10 laps from the end, when Sebastian's gearbox clunked its way to death. I know it may seem strange for me to include this race on my list at all, since admittedly Nico got rather lucky with the issues that befell Seb and Lewis, but it was the final 7 laps where he really earned his praise. During the final safety car period, Mark Webber pitted for fresh medium tyres, emerging in 5th place. Nico also had fresh tyres, but they were a set of hards, either because Mercedes had run out of fresh mediums or out of an abundance of caution due to tyre failures. Nico now had a problem. Webber would almost definitely overtake the cars between them before the end of the race, so it was up to Nico to build enough of a gap so that Webber couldn't also catch him. Despite the situation, he just about did enough, hanging on to win by less than 0.8 of a second. We all know the story of how Mercedes got the 2014 regulations exactly right, hitting the ground running and the nail on the head and producing one of the most dominant Formula 1 cars of all time. As a result of this, Nico found himself embroiled in his first championship fight in F1, the so-called Silver War with Lewis Hamilton, which saw the two former friends fall out and collide several times. I could very easily have made this list entirely including races from 2014 through to 2016, but I understand that the undeniably strong performances from both Nico and Lewis were exaggerated by the might of their cars, so I've kept it to a minimum of 2 races per year. In 2014, my pick for Nico's best race is the Brazilian Grand Prix, where he kept the championship alive by beating his teammate at Lewis's home away from home. It all started when Rosberg narrowly took pole position by just 0.03 of a second and then led into turn 1. Hamilton pushed hard to catch up, but eventually Rosberg's pace proved too much and Hamilton spun. Nico eventually won the race, leading home Mercedes team's 11th 1-2 finish of the year. This race is a bit different, as it isn't one where he won. Instead, it demonstrates his fighting spirit and his will to never give up. Due to a strange double points rule that only lasted for one race, the 2014 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix is officially the most valuable Grand Prix in history, so when Nico's ERS system failed before the halfway point, it was clear to see that it was all over for him. He had already been running behind Lewis, needing something dramatic to happen for him to even have a chance of winning, so the loss of 160 horsepower was basically the end of the road. The team told him there was no chance anymore and that he should retire the car, but Nico decided to continue. He wanted to finish the race, just so he could show himself and his fans that he never gave up. He eventually finished 14th, a whole lap behind Lewis, who became world champion for the second time. In 2015, Nico did what only 3 other drivers have ever done by winning the Monaco Grand Prix for the 3rd time in a row. I decided not to include his 2014 win due to the sketchy nature of his pole position, and I know there will be people who say that his 2015 win was just down to luck, since Mercedes failed Lewis by pitting him under the virtual safety car, but I'd like you to really think about how difficult it must be to do 78 laps of Monaco at this sort of pace. Anyone who can win here even once is a borderline superhuman in my opinion. Unfortunately, Nico's form really dropped after Monaco, and Lewis was able to claim the championship with 3 Grand Prix still to go. It seemed that the Silver War had really got under Nico's skin, and he ended up nearly losing second in the championship to Sebastian Vettel. However, he was able to send a statement to the opposition by winning the last 3 rounds of the championship, including winning a straight fight in Abu Dhabi after snatching pole position by nearly 4/10 of a second. It was a sign of things to come as he headed into the 2016 season. As alluded to, Nico kept up his strong form into 2016, extending his winning streak to 7 in a row. The most dominant of his 7 wins was the 7th, by a boring 25 seconds around the boring Sochi Autodrome. The reason this win stands out over the others is that it was Nico's first ever Grand Chelem, meaning he took pole position and fastest lap, led every single lap of the Grand Prix and then won the race. It's worth noting that Hamilton had an issue in qualifying which forced him to start from P10, significantly reducing the pressure on Rosberg, but this entry on the list can refer to the start of his season as a whole. After 4 races, Nico led the championship by 43 points, leaving Lewis to play a game of catch-up. After a crash with Lewis in Spain and 2 disappointing races in Monaco and Canada, Nico's lead shrank to just 9 points. However, the brand new Baku circuit had every chance of throwing a real curveball. It's the mark of a champion to be able to adapt to new circuits and situations quickly, and that's exactly what Nico demonstrated at the one and only time he raced in Azerbaijan, at the confusingly named European Grand Prix. Throughout the weekend, Nico seemed to have an advantage over Lewis, and in pushing hard in qualifying to try to catch up, Lewis hit the wall and damaged his suspension, forcing a start from P10 on the grid. This left the door wide open for Nico to score another Grand Chelem, winning by 17 seconds over Vettel while Lewis could only manage 5th. Obviously this was another slightly lucky win, but at the end of the day the best you can do is what's asked of you, and in all honesty I think he had the legs over Lewis anyway. Nico would ultimately win 4 more races, sealing the title by just 5 points in a tense championship finale at Abu Dhabi. Just 2 years after his end-of-year heartbreak, Nico had finally achieved his lifelong dream of becoming world champion, and he announced his retirement shortly afterwards. In all honesty, I think Nico truly deserved this world championship, and anyone who says he got lucky because of his car and because of Hamilton's misfortune is ignoring the bigger picture. Listening to Nico talk about how much he sacrificed for this championship from both a physical and mental standpoint is honestly awe-inspiring, and you can tell that he knew it was a case of now or never. Personally, I rank Nico as one of the greatest drivers of all time, as well as one of the most underrated world champions. He was intelligent, fast and consistent, and his victory was a fairy tale story. I always think that to truly deserve anything, you have to be a good person in general and give back to others, especially if you have the platform to do so. Throughout the years, Nico has represented and given substantial amounts of money to organisations such as Tribute to Bambi, a foundation helping disadvantaged youths in Germany, Laureus Sport for Good, a foundation raising money for children through sport, Ein Herz für Kinder, a German children's aid organisation, Viva con Agua de St. Pauli, a charity supplying basic sanitation to people in underdeveloped countries, the NAACP Legal Defence and Educational Fund, in response to the George Floyd protests, as well as various environmental charities. He has also appeared in anti-drink driving campaigns. Thanks for all that you've done, Nico, and thanks to you all for watching Career View Mirror.